Okay, well, welcome to Synergy Online, and thank you all for attending Inventory Tools and Utilities with Darren Morgan. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, but if you have a question at any time, we'll be collecting those in the questions module on your toolbar, and Ricky George will be providing answers as we go along today. Now I'd like to welcome Darren Morgan, Business Analyst and Senior Consultant at Key2Act. Darren joined Key2Act in 2005, serving our customers with his expertise in mobile tech, schedule, Power BI, and optimizing business processes. Prior to joining Key2Act, Darren worked as a network and system administration consultant before finally specializing in ERP software conversions. First certified with Solomon, then with Dynamics GP. Welcome, Darren.
Well, thanks, Laura. And thanks everyone for joining. As Laura said, I'm got more of a network administrator and systems administrator kind of a background. If you haven't heard my previous sessions, I always let customers know at the beginning that I'm not a debits and credits person. I work for an accounting software company, but I'm not an accountant. I'm very process oriented, and I work as a business analyst and help customers with process automation and process efficiency. So I do a lot of system reviews for customers, and when I visit customers and look at how they're using their ERP software, I see a lot of customers underutilizing the system. And I see a lot of people who work very hard but not smart. So my goal is always to help your staff to work hard and smart. So we're going to talk about inventory and some of the utilities available in the inventory module and how you guys might be able to better utilize the system in your company. So we're going to talk a little bit about the setups within Signature and Dynamics GP, core inventory. We'll talk about some of the setup options and maybe not setup, but configuration that will help you to best leverage the system's capabilities. And then we'll talk about ways to streamline inventory, the purchase and using tools like the PO generator. So we'll talk a little bit about mobile. For those of you who I've worked with in the past, you probably know I'm the mobile tech guy on the consulting staff. So we'll talk a little bit about considerations for your mobile inventory, setting up technician vehicles as inventory sites. Again, we'll talk about the PO generator and some of the detailed setups that are necessary to make all that work. We'll talk about transferring inventory between trucks and sites and the extensions that we have available to make that job a little bit easier for you. And then we've got a case study of another customer that had a customization created for ordering replacement parts for their maintenance calls. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is our item maintenance window. This is the starting point for all things inventory. So you can see here when you're creating a new item, there's really only 3 fields that are required. You've got to have an item number, a description, and a unit of measure associated to it. But if you're only entering the little bit of data, you're really shortchanging your organization. So it's all the other data on this window that allows your company to maximize the use of your inventory module. So again, when I talk to customers, I like to talk about the policies. It's the executive team and the management staff should be setting policies, and based upon your policies, we can create the procedures of how to use the software. So in the inventory realm, when we're talking about item maintenance, we really should have a policy that we should populate this window to the greatest extent possible. So I talk to customers about the short description and generic description and how to use those things for reporting or for filtering. So if your item is something like PVC pipe, you'll want to create a short description that is a a broader base. So the specific item might be a 3-inch PVC pipe. The short description would just be the generic PVC pipe, and then the generic description would be pipe in general. So it's that type of thing you want to consider in the short description and generic description to help you filter groups of inventory. Then as we talk about sales inventory, the item type. Sales inventory is it's the default setting when you open this window. But sales inventory is the items that you stock on the shelf, traditional inventory items. The other inventory item type that I like to make use of is the services item type. And services item types are used to get a billable line item with a specific description onto an invoice. And typically services items are things like a tool rental or perhaps consumables. So in a tool rental, if your technicians are taking a welder out to the job site, you're probably going to want to charge $75 or $100 for the use of that custom tool. And so services item types would be used. Now, when you select services item type, the valuation method gets grayed out automatically. That's just a core GP function. But obviously, if it's an item on stock, we've got to determine what is the valuation method, FIFO, LIFO, average. So that's a selection option. Your sales tax, you have to have an item selected off of this drop-down list that you see here, and it's going to most likely be taxable, but it could be non-taxed. And then when you're purchasing it, there's also the tax option. Quantity decimals, that's another consideration. Do you really need to sell fractions of this item? You know, you don't always have to sell fractions. If you're selling a gallon, you might set up a unit of measure schedule to accommodate that, but we'll talk about the unit of measure schedule in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the item classes. So classes are common throughout Dynamics GP, but in the inventory module, item class is a way that you can select a specific class and automatically populate a variety of different fields that you see here on this window. So I talked about services item types. I use them a lot in mobile tech. So I typically, for a customer, would set up an item class ID called services. And you could auto-populate the generic description, or the item type obviously would be selected as services. And you could set up any one of these other pricing options. So typically when I'm setting up services item types, my pricing method would not be a percentage markup over current cost or standard cost. It'll either be list price or perhaps a currency value. So when you're renting that welder, your per diem charge is going to be a flat rate, $75, and it'll always show up on the invoice at that dollar amount. Another thing that I like to point out is maintaining history. You know, the checkboxes in the lower left, those are not checked by default, so I always recommend check all 4 of those boxes and maintain history on all the items, whether it's a stock item or a services item type. Finally, with item classes, we can make changes to all items within that class. So if I open this window and I make a change in one area or another, Dynamics GP is going to prompt me and say, do you want to roll down this change to all items in the class? So if you did want to make a change in your pricing method for that group of items, you could change the pricing method and then roll it down to all items in the class. Back on the item maintenance window, we're going to see a lot of this. The highlighted button at the top of the button bar is the go-to button. And so you're always going to want to start at the item maintenance window and select your item that you want to work with, then click the go-to and select, in this case, the quantities and sites. When you select that, you get the quantities and sites maintenance window. So this is where you can manually assign an item to a site ID. So this is a way to assign items one at a time. So if you're adding a new item to inventory and it's just one new item, it's easy to just go in and select the main site where that item is going to be housed. If you're doing groups, then you'll do a mass site assignment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The other field that I want to point out on this window is going to be your primary vendor ID. So there's a whole lot of setups that are necessary to get the PO generator working, and primary vendor must be assigned to an item in order for the PO generator to work. So keep that in mind. The other aspect of this window that I like to point out is there's a selection of the sites where you can look at a specific site ID and you can see the quantities on hand and the other associated quantities that you see there on the list for that specific warehouse, or you could select all and it will show you all items, quantities in the business. Next, let's talk about the purchasing options. Again, we're back at the main inventory item screen. We clicked our Go To button and select purchasing, and that opens up the purchasing options window. So what we're seeing here is our unit of measure, and it's important that you have a unique unit of measure for when you're buying things, and a unit of measure schedule that will allow you to sell those items as well. Now, this particular presentation that I'm delivering was set up by a coworker of mine, and he chose each to buy a case of oil or sell it by each. I'm a beer guy, so I always talk about beer as a means of understanding the unit of measure schedule. So if I'm running a store where I can buy beer by the case, I could then choose to sell that by the case, but I might also sell it by the 6-pack or sell an individual bottle. So that gives you an idea of how your unit of measure schedules need to be set up so that you're purchasing it in a certain unit of measure, but you're selling it using other units of measure. So keep that in mind. Again, we're back at the main item maintenance window, selected our Go To, and we're going to talk a little bit about item vendor maintenance. So I'm a big advocate of creating your own item numbering scheme. And when you're creating that numbering scheme, you want to do it in a way that's going to be commonsensical to your staff people. So I like using an item alphanumeric or alpha prefix with a numeric suffix. The purpose of the alpha prefix is to give everything a common prefix of 3, 4, 5 letters that'll be some indication of what that is. If it's a type of capacitor or if it's a pipe, you might use the pipe as the prefix. But every item number has to be unique, and therefore we have to have some numbers to tack on to the end. So whether it's 3, 4, 5 numbers, depending on the quantities of specific items that you're using, you'll want to have that item number suffix. So create your own numbering sequence for your items so that you can manage them within the warehouse, and people who are coming into the warehouse to look for something on the shelf, they'll understand the pipe is over there in that section of the warehouse. But when you have your own numbering system, you'll need to set up your vendor item number so that when you're creating a purchase order for that internal item and it's being printed on the vendor's purchase order, it'll actually print the vendor's item number. So the vendor knows what he has to pick off of his shelf. And that's where for each of your items, you're going to want to come in here, select your vendor ID and put in that vendor's number associated to it. Also, when you're selecting that vendor and when you're purchasing from that vendor, you've got to determine, are you using the purchasing unit of measure from the item setup or from the vendor? And also, when you're ordering from this vendor, we want to set up these min-max economic order point or order multiple And this will be different for all vendors. Um, as you're thinking about the way that you purchase your items, you probably would have a local vendor that you could quickly get some parts from if you only need one or two. But if you're going to stock the shelf and you want to buy a couple of cases of these items, you can get them cheaper from a national vendor who's going to ship them in. And so you want to define some of these settings to reflect that quantity order information. Next, let's talk about item resource planning. Again, we're back to our main item maintenance screen with the go-to button. And when you select the item resource planning, it opens up this window that you see here. So this is where we're going to define some of the details associated with using the PO generator feature in Dynamics GP. So you can see that the order policy on the middle left, we've selected use PO generator for this particular item so that we can look at the details associated to it. But not all items need to be set up to use the PO generator. These would be items that you have a lot of turns. So they're frequently ordered items, or critical items that you always have to make sure you have an adequate quantity on the shelf. So those types of items you want to set up to use the PO generator. If they're seasonal items or things that you just use a one-off here or there, you don't have to use the PO generator. You just leave that on the normal setting. So we're going to choose the order policy and the replenishment method. Typically, that's going to be we're going to buy more items to fulfill it. And these are some of the details of the PO generator. So you can select from the order method, replenishment level, vendor selection, and cost selection. And there's a whole lot of detail here, too much to go into in great depth. But save it to say that if we're selecting the replenishment level, those are the settings that we saw in the item vendor setup. And we could select on the replenishment level either the order point quantity, the order up to a certain level, or the vendor EOQ, which is economic order quantity. So if we know that buying 2 cases makes the most sense from this vendor, we would select that. In the vendor selection, you're either going to choose the primary vendor that we purchase from. That might be your local vendor that you use on a regular basis, but you could change that selection to the lowest cost vendor and order from that vendor that's going to ship you cases from across the country, but at a much lower price. And then the last vendor selection would be, we need the shortest lead time. So that lead time might be critical. If you've got a job coming up, you got to make sure you have the stuff in the warehouse. You want to order it that way. The last is our option here is the cost selection, and your options there are the last originating invoice cost, which is probably the most common, but you could also put the current cost, standard cost, or a cost specified in the functional currency. If you're using multi-currency, that could also be an option. So a lot of options here, but you want to make sure that you get those things set up on your item vendor card and set up here in the item resource planning so that the PO generator is following some of these configuration rules. Next, let's talk about quantities and sites. We saw this window earlier and how we can assign sites. We can also do our bins there. Let's talk about mass assignment of sites. So when I'm setting up a new system, we've got to set up these site IDs and configure them, and then use the assign button to populate that warehouse with all of the items that are going to be stocked on the shelves. Now, one of the big considerations when you're setting your items up, and the reason you might want to have that alphanumeric numbering scheme that I mentioned earlier is because the items of a common type would be grouped together in your item number list. The other thing that I like to point out is when we're mass assigning, the system will look at allow you to point to the generic description and then also the class ID. So if we're setting up a class of services item types, those can all be assigned to the specific warehouse as a group by just selecting the class ID. So that numbering convention, the naming convention, using some of these other fields associated with the item, it all makes getting this mass item assignment done a little bit easier. So let's talk about vehicles as mobile warehouses. So you want to carefully consider the items that are going to be assigned to truck stock. When your technician is looking at his mobile tech device and selecting items, you don't want him looking at all 5,000 items that are in the main warehouse. It gets cumbersome. And also, when you do that item assignment, your stock count sheets, when you're doing your physical stock counts for your items, all of the items assigned to that warehouse are going to show up on the stock count sheet. So typically we want to make sure that your technician's trucks only have assigned to that warehouse the items that are commonly used by that technician. So the other thing I like to point out here is the description of the truck site. So you can see the site ID is TRK, just an abbreviation for truck, but the description should include the technician's name. Now the description can easily be changed. If a technician retires or is no longer working with the company, somebody can come in here, assign that truck to another technician and come in and change the name. But we'll see why that's important in a little bit. So again, assigning all items to all sites is definitely overkill. You want to pay attention to how you can group those items together. So a lot of times I might just temporarily do this because the items in the warehouse, it's a subset of those items that will commonly be used as truck stock. And so oftentimes I'll just use a SQL update to change the generic description on a group of items and call them truck stock. And then I could use that generic description to just put the truck stock parts on and assign it to the trucks. So there's little tips and tricks that I've used over the years to try to make this process as efficient as possible. But just keep in mind that you only want to assign the items that are commonly used by that truck, so that when you're printing your stock count sheets, you're only getting a limited number of items on those stock count sheets. So the next setup, when you're setting up a vehicle for a technician, on the technician setup window, there's an inventory sites button. And when you select that inventory sites button, you'll then see the selection list of all of the inventory sites that are in the system. And this is exactly why I recommend that you use the technician's name in the site description, so that it's very clear when you click this lookup list that you're not just seeing truck number 8 and you don't know who's assigned to it, but when you're assigning technician Alan, you can clearly see in the site description that this is Alan Flint's technician truck. So it's easier to do this technician site assignment when you do it that way. Next, let's talk a little bit about mobile tech and how mobile inventory is used, some of the setup options that are available for how it's going to be used. You know, not all customers use inventory, and so inventory could be turned off as an option. But if you are using inventory, obviously you would want to set that to true in your mobile tech setups. The next question becomes, do you use non-inventory items? And typically the answer is yes. I see technicians all the time, they're rolling around with their truck and they've got spare parts. Maybe the last job that was done, there were a few extra parts, they were already billed to the customer, so they're not on the inventory per se, but it's a spare part that that technician can use. And so you want to be able to charge for it, but you don't want to track the numbers for that specific item. So that would be a non-inventory item. Inventory validation level, this is a mobile tech setup option. It's either optional, warning, or required. In mobile tech, if you set this to be a warning, the technician would get a prompt when he's trying to complete his appointment, and the prompt would say, you're missing recommended data, you haven't entered inventory items. So obviously when a technician is out doing service work, he doesn't necessarily use inventory items on every service call. So I don't think I would ever want this to be a required, which means he cannot complete his service call without entering inventory. So typically I usually would set this to either optional or warning. The next two mobile tech options are inventory cost and inventory price. And it's up to you. Do you want the technician to see that data in his mobile tech device or not? And then the last option would be, do you want the technician to see the inventory quantity that is on his truck? Now keep in mind that that inventory quantity is the item that the database is showing. And that might not always line up with the physical possession. So mobile tech does not stop that technician from adding an inventory item, even if the quantity is below zero. The assumption is if he's got physical possession of that part, we don't want to stop him from adding it into mobile tech and completing his call. But if that item quantity is less than one, when somebody in the back office is doing the mobile tech inventory processing, they will get an eConnect error, and they will have to do an inventory adjustment to add that inventory item in so that then it can be processed through to the service call. So it's a feature of mobile tech. The assumption is if the guy's got physical possession of it, we're not going to stop him from adding it as an inventory item onto his service call. Next, let's talk a little bit about inventory barcoding. I get this question a lot. Does mobile tech support barcoding? And the short answer is yes, but you have to keep in mind if you've ever tried to scan a barcode with your cell phone camera, it's not easy. And it's because of the camera's focus. You have to take some time and get that barcode exactly lined up. And as you can see in my screenshot here, when it lines up and the heavens and the earth align, you will get the barcode reading. But it's not our goal for mobile tech technicians in the field to be taking their time barcoding. It's far easier for them to just thumb type a handful of numbers, or digits, because if you're following the numbering scheme that I mentioned earlier, if this technician needs to open up a filter or search for a filter, he's going to type FIL because he knows that's the prefix for filters. It's going to automatically filter down his inventory list on mobile tech, so he'll be able to select those parts quite easily without barcoding them. Now, all that being said, if you really want to barcode, and the barcoding story that I like to tell relating to mobile tech was a customer many years ago that did ATM servicing, and their barcoded inventory item numbers were like 20 character hyphenated alphanumeric strings, very complex, but because of the nature of the high-tech ATM parts, everything was barcoded, all the parts were. And so they invested in Bluetooth scanners for their mobile technicians to use. And the reason for that is when you've got the barcode wand, it's very easy to see from the laser when you squeeze the trigger. It's very easy to lay it onto that barcode and get that reading very quickly and efficiently, as opposed to moving your cell phone camera around to try to get it to read. Next, I want to put in a plug for one of our sponsors, which is Panatrack. I'll tell you, I just got off a project last year with the Panatrack team, and it is a pleasure working with them. They really know their product quite well. They're masters of all things inventory, And so if you're considering a barcoding project with your inventory, I would also ask that you consider using Panatrack as part of that solution. So next, let's talk a little bit about transferring items. Pretty straightforward. We're going to open up the item transfer entry window, and we're going to select a site that the part is being moved from, and a site the part is being moved to. So on each line item, we're going to select the quantity and enter the quantity, and then we can use this quantity type to specify why this transfer was taking place. If it was a damaged part, it might be going to the scrap warehouse. But moving those items from place to place is done using the item transfer window. Another feature of Dynamics GP is what you see here, the transfer in transit inventory. So this is just letting you know that a way to let you know that this item is in transit. It's not physically present in one warehouse or another. It's literally on a truck being moved, and it will not show up in that destination warehouse until it's actually received. So it's a two-step transfer process that allows you to designate that this thing is in transit for a period of time. Next, let's talk a little bit about one of our extensions. I'm joined by Ricky as our host today. Ricky's one of our technical consultants who's been a part of building some of our technical consulting extensions, but this is one of them. So one of the business problems that a lot of our customers have is trucks get moved from one technician to the other, and we want to be able to move the inventory quantities quickly and easily from one truck to another. So we've built this extension to build the transfer where you're going to identify those trucks A and B, select the build transfer button, and all items with on-hand quantities will automatically be populated in the item transfer window. So instead of going one at a time and selecting all the individual items, we're auto-populating this window for you. Next, let's talk about the PO generator and the setups involved in that. So here we're looking at the main warehouse. We talked earlier about assigning the primary vendor that will be used by the PO generator. When we go back to our item resource planning, select the PO generator button. We've got our policies that we defined earlier. We've got our setups that we've selected. And then we're going to click the PO generator or select the PO generator transaction, and it's going to open this window and allow us a variety of selections here. So you can see the restrictions on the window and the upper portion. We can restrict this particular purchase to a group of item numbers. We could limit it by a site ID, a buyer ID, vendor ID, or class ID. Typically, I would expect to see site IDs. So if you've got multiple branch offices and multiple warehouses, you've probably got different people in charge of those different warehouses, and they're going to select their specific site ID when doing this purchasing. And when they click the PO generator, we're going to see a window pop up like this that's going to show us the recommended purchases that need to be fulfilled. And this is a suggestion that we could choose the Mark All button to check the boxes that you see on the left-hand column to include all of those items in this purchase. It's going to default to the primary vendor selection. So you can see there are multiple vendors on this particular selection window. So when we generate these purchase orders, it's going to generate 3. But if there were multiple items associated with a single vendor, all of those multiple items will be grouped onto the purchase order appropriately. So when we generate those purchase orders, we're going to see a report created that's going to notify us, here's your purchase order number, here's the items that were on there, there's the unit cost associated with it. So the PO generator, like I said at the beginning, I think there's a lot of customers that underutilize their ERP system. And this is one of the inventory features that I see that very few customers, in my experience, are actually using this to its greatest advantage. But when this is put in place, it really reduces the administrative overhead for some of those warehouse managers. So if you're not using this today, by all means, you should consider deploying some of these setups that we've talked about here. Next, let's talk about the another extension that we have for this is our contract calls replacement parts. Now, this is an extension that was created for Fidelity Power Systems. Fidelity Power Systems are a Kohler generator dealer, I believe. And so the common parts that are used for a specific model, though there's a setup option on the equipment window to add those replacement parts. So when all those replacement parts are added, we can draw from that list of replacement parts and automatically create a SOP invoice. So the PO generator then works together to see the orders that are pending and looks at your total on-hand quantities, the orders that are out there, and this resource planning all comes together to determine what replacement parts need to be ordered. So as you see here, the replacement parts are just added to inventory selection. When you open this replacement parts window, you get the lookup to add those specific parts for that item or that equipment ID. And then finally, when we open up our MCC call generation window, we get the add-on button for the SOP replacement parts. So when you click that SOP, create SOP invoices, what this is going to do is look at all of the equipment that's scheduled, excuse me. Sorry about that, had to clear my throat. So you get all of these SOP invoices and all of the associated parts with all of the equipment that is on an MCC call for this month, and all of those items will be added to this list. There's also an associated SSRS report. And this looks like a repeat slide. But that just tells you, shows us the replacement parts extension. Now, this presentation, as I said, was created by one of my coworkers, Ken Davis. But we also have another customization. This isn't one of our commonly sold extensions, but the customization was done several years ago. We've deployed it for a few customers that does a similar process to what this extension is doing with SOP item parts, but rather than looking at the replacement parts on the piece of equipment, it looks at the task materials. So consider that as well when you're setting up new tasks for monthly maintenance or quarterly maintenance. You can have inventory items that are associated with that specific task. And in that case, rather than creating the SOP document and using the PO generator, we're simply looking at the tasks and the task materials and creating a purchase order manually out of that. So that's another customization that might help streamline your ordering process to make sure that you've got all of those items required for your monthly maintenance calls in the warehouse, or get them ordered quickly. So in conclusion, there's a variety of ways to configure this module. Like I said, there's a lot of details. The real benefit to your company is going to come from populating those details that a lot of customers don't focus on. But things like that PO generator is a huge win. So you want to make sure that you're always consistent in the way in which you're entering that data. Again, the executive policy should determine procedures, and we always should have a way of auditing to make sure that the staff is following procedures and entering all of the data accordingly. By leveraging all of these tools, the built-in GP utilities, or even some of our consulting extensions, it's all a way to more efficiently manage your system. So if you have any other questions or want to engage an inventory project to try to streamline some of your inventory usage, please reach out to your customer success manager and let us know. That's it. Thanks, Laura.
Sure. Well, thanks, Darren, for your presentation, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us for Inventory Tools and Utilities. If you do have questions after today's session, you can email us at synergy@key2act.com, or like Darren said, you can contact your CSM. All of our Synergy online sessions will be posted to the Key2Act resources site early next week, and you'll receive an email notification at that time. Next slide. A special thank you to our sponsors who are really looking forward to connecting with you at Synergy this year. If you have interest in learning more about our sponsors, please visit the Key2Act resources site or reach out to your CSM. A reminder that we're giving away a $500 gift card of your choice. The more sessions you attend, the more chances you have to win. You can register for the remaining sessions using the link in the chat box. Our next session, Building Optimization, What's in it for your clients, begins at 12 p.m. Central Time today. Thank you all for attending.